Hello. Welcome everyone to the Breakdown with Berckenhoff episode 23. It has been a very long time since the last podcast. In fact, I was actually looking back this morning, and it wasn't the last podcast we did, episode 22, was during the massive Texas snowstorm that hit Texas. So it's kind of funny that was the last one, being the last kind of major event that hit Texas, especially the areas. Well, it hit all of Texas, really. So, but I'm just going to give a few announcements about what has happened more than anything. I'm still going to be doing my podcast. I'm not going away. The podcast is still going to happen. I'm going to try to have it once a week like I was before. The reason why I didn't necessarily have it this past month, maybe even longer than a month now, was because I was doing two things, really. First thing I was doing was focusing on topic streams, or at least what I'm calling topic streams, being where I would discuss the educational system, I discussed justice reform, I discussed police reform, I discussed the opioid epidemic or pandemic. I don't think it's... Anyway, I discussed opioid problems. I've discussed a little bit about healthcare on streams. And I would spend a week or two just on one topic, trying to learn basically live on air about the topic, and then go from there. And be more kind of educational streams, even if I don't know everything about the topic, and that was kind of the purpose of it. So I was focusing a lot on those, and I kind of ran out of time in the week to do the podcast, even though I had all the tabs ready and everything was ready to go. But just didn't happen that way. So I might actually load some of those episodes up for the podcast as like special episodes. They're not really necessarily going to count as part of the news podcast that I usually do. But I still think some of them are good content to have, especially if you're interested in any one of those topics that I just mentioned. And what I'll probably be doing there, if I decide to do so, is editing some of the streams together so that it's not all dead air. I mean, I was always speaking in the episode, but more like the highlights of each day that I discussed the issue, and put it all together for one kind of special episode, maybe once a week or something like that. But we'll see about that. And yes, I'm still getting the answers. We've done it every week with my co-host Anna Voltes, where we alternate the channels. So I'm going to go to upload those episodes. Some of the episodes are going to be probably out of date because it was my fault for not really uploading them to the podcast feed. So some of them we talked about recent events, or an event that was happening at that time, which I guess is a recent event, but you get what I'm saying. So those may be a little bit out of date for when I uploaded it as a podcast. But most of the episodes we do are kind of large topics, so they're not really necessarily going to be out of date, such as when we talked about the foster care system. That is kind of a topic that's always going to be in discussion and relating to issues like that. And the second thing as to why I was kind of not doing the podcast was because I'm trying to start up a club here at my college for the Libertarian Party, or just the Libertarian Club, because it's not like the Libertarian Party is involved directly in the club, but you get what I'm saying, for the Libertarian movement, you could say. So I was trying to get all that done before the end of the semester happens, but I don't think that is necessarily going to happen because of the things that are needed to form the club. So now that I don't necessarily think I'm going to be able to do it, I'm going to have more time also to focus on making sure to upload a podcast. But anyway, that was kind of the main reasons why I wasn't necessarily doing a podcast. But so we're back now, and we got a lot to talk about. Some of the stuff we're going to be talking about in today's podcast is going back a couple weeks, but more of the major topics that I thought I needed to provide my thoughts on, or at least give some topics about, or information about, whatever you want to ultimately call it. So that is what we're going to be discussing for today's episode. But I'm just going to give one more quick shout out. Make sure to go to freedomscoop.com. I know the website is under construction now, but if you like my content, you'll probably like their content as well, through the Generational Gap, J. Edgar, Stephen Edgar Ramus, or R-Rated Conservative, or the Freckles and Brit Show. These are all shows that talk about not daily events, but talk about political news and culture, and give our inputs to current events that aren't necessarily from an everyday person's perspective. Alright, now we can get into the episode and try not to make this announcement section 15 minutes long, but rather 6 minutes long. So alright, here we go. So the first thing that needed to be discussed for today's episode is obviously the events that are happening with Derek Chauvin. Last week, when I had all of this ready to go and ended up not doing the podcast, it was when Derek Chauvin was in trial. And the verdict hadn't been implemented. Now we know the verdict, and we know that Derek Chauvin has been charged on all 3 accounts of what he was charged for. And we're going to be reading about what those 3 accounts were, because I want to make sure that I say the right things and not say the wrong charge that he was charged with. But now he's going to be going to have some time for the courts to form, not necessarily opinions, but form a statute, I guess you could say. Not a statute, but basically there's a process that Derek Chauvin is going to go into before he ultimately gets charged with how long of a sentence he is going to be and what type of jail he is going to be going to. And there's different terms and different policies for what has to happen now. And I'm going to be linking a video in the comment section of the video and in the description of the video when I finish, if you're interested in what some of these processes are and the terminology that's used. I can't remember the terminology now, unfortunately, because I watched the video a couple days ago, but there's this YouTuber that did a really good job on what he thought the charge was going to be for Chauvin, how many years and what type of prison he was going to go to, where he also kind of explained the process of how he is going to be charged with the years and, well, type of prison, as I've already mentioned. So I am going to be linking that down in the description and comment sections. But long story short, that is what Derek Chauvin is waiting for now, is to be charged and what type of prison he is going to be going to. If you believe the guy from the YouTube channel in the video I'm going to link, he thinks he's probably most likely going to get a maximum security prison just because of his statue just because of how high profile Derek Chauvin is compared to the average, criminal of the streets, being the cop that killed George Floyd and sparked a massive movement from it because of how blatant the jester was. Now, a lot of people have been arguing that Derek Chauvin's charge of all 3 counts that we are going to be reading about here shortly was a little bit overcharged. One of those YouTubers that I was listening to get kind of a different perspective on is Actual Justice Warrior, where he states that he didn't think that they had enough evidence to charge him of the highest charge, or the charge that comes with the most weight, because they couldn't necessarily prove several things. And he also mentioned the fact that at that time, the system for disabling the criminal or disabling the person under arrest was at one point to use the knee, as Derek Chauvin was using, although in his state and where he lives in New York, that was decided not to be used because of how it's supposed to be done, because you don't necessarily know what type of medical conditions that person is under, and that type of hold for the person who's being arrested could come at a very life-threatening case, and that was the case for George Floyd. But at the time, the neck hold was something that was very interesting. One other thing before we get into the article that I wanted to mention was you have to remember that the trial itself, and a lot of people are talking about the jury of the trial, because there was an article that came out, if I'm remembering right, by the New York Times that basically listed the jury members and what their professions were. Now, they didn't necessarily give the jury members' names, but they were able to basically say they were a doctor about this age, type of thing. And a lot of people thought that that was a weird thing to do for several reasons. One, many jurors could find that their life could be threatened, or if they were to give the wrong ruling, that they could undergo some threats against them, even if the article or whatever didn't necessarily give their name. A lot of people were thinking if the verdict went the wrong way, say Derek Chauvin didn't get charged with any of the three, or maybe just the lowest charge, that there would have been people, for lack of better words, crazy enough to find that jury member who may have caused that hang jury, or the jury member that may have caused a charge to be lesser than what the mob or the people wanted the charge to be. And that was, a lot of people are kind of talking about that. And we're also going to get to what Maxine Waters talked about, for those that are following any recent news, and how she did something that was remarkably dumb about the Derek Chauvin trial. So now that we're kind of caught up on recent events and average thoughts of the jury, many people thought that the jury should have been similar to OJ's jury members, where they were to be taken away from being able to go back to their homes between days and whatnot. Be sequestered is, I believe, the term, if I remember right. So anyway, let's get into our first article. This is by NBC News. How many years will Derek Chauvin be in prison after guilty Floyd's verdict? After deliberating for 10 hours, juries in the trial of Derek Chauvin returned a guilty verdict Tuesday, convicting the former Minneapolis police officer of murder and manslaughter in the killing of George Floyd, a black man who struggled to breathe while pinned under Chauvin's knee, as we all know. The trial's conclusion collapsed tremendous months of national protests over the issue and race and policing following Floyd's death. Last May, and the jury's decision became a movement of reckoning, particularly for Black Americans disillusioned with racial progress. Chauvin, 45, must still be sentenced, while 3 other former officers who were at the scene face their own trials. Chauvin's defense might also choose to appeal the verdict. How did the juries reach their conclusion? Juries considered 3 charges: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. The second-degree murder charge required the jury to agree that Chauvin caused Floyd's death without intent, while committing or attempting to commit an assault. For the third-degree murder charge to stick, jurors had to agree that Chauvin unintentionally caused Floyd's death with reckless disregard for human life. The charge doesn't indicate intent. Finally, the second-degree manslaughter charge needs juries to conclude that Chauvin was guilty of creating an unreasonable risk by constantly taking a chance of causing Floyd's death or injuring him. The defense argued that Chauvin followed his training when he knelt on Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes, an act caught on by bystander video and shown at the trial. That was another thing that people were talking about as well, because this case was very unique because of that bystander video, and I do think it needs to be mentioned or at least thought about. many legal YouTubers, either through justice system, through having maybe a criminal justice degree, or just being interested in the justice system, to people who are lawyers that have YouTube channels that talk about law. Now, you could say that they may not necessarily be reliable, they may come with their bias, blah, 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 blah. But many of those people brought up that question. And the reason I think it's important is because we need to remember that videos like the one that the George Floyd murder are extremely emotional. And in the jury room, in the trial, they showed all of the video, all of the 9-minute plus video of the death of George Floyd. Some people bring up the question, and I know I repeated this already a couple times, but they bring up the question over, should that video have been played in trial? Because a lot of times both sides try to make the jury a little bit emotional to their cause. And it's a very good strategy, more on the prosecution side, I would argue, to try to make the defender or the defendant, the person they're going against, either seem like extremely bad guy, an extremely bad person you would never want your kid to be around, or you would never want to be around yourself, or make your victim in the case, either through the death or whatever the case was, emotional in what happened there. So long story short, there's a big debate going around, I would say now, over if a video like that should be played in court because of the emotional impact it can have on the jury members. Because these jury members who are sitting there and judging this case and ultimately going to give their decision on it as regular Americans have an extremely important impact. And these people are not all cops. There's not cops sitting up there that have seen death before. There's not doctors up there that might have seen death before. There's not people that are used to seeing death, and especially not used to seeing death in the way that was done on the video of George Floyd's killing. So, the question becomes, should a video like that be used in a future trial? And ultimately, I'm not sure on what I necessarily think of that question. I do think it had a massive impact in the case of George Floyd and the case of ultimately Derek Chauvin. Now, so that is a tough question to answer, because ultimately I do think that it probably had a very big importance to all three charges that happened on Derek Chauvin. Now, you could argue that these juries are probably, in theory, not have supposed to have seen the video before, although I would argue the majority of Americans have probably seen at least part of the video, but that's a whole other question. So, I do think that had an extremely important impact on their decision. If the video was taken away and they weren't allowed to show it, and they still had to argue their case, I still think that Derek Chauvin probably would have been taken away in all three accounts because of the many medical investigators, I guess you could call them, the medical investigator. I'm just going to say medical investigators, and what they said about the case for Derek Chauvin and how long, and especially the police chief that came out and basically said that what Derek Chauvin did was wrong against their training. Although the knee was part of their training regimen and part of how they're supposed to restrain their victim in the case of something similar to George Floyd if it were to happen. But he still did it for too long, and there was many warning signs, blah, 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 to have been able to subdue George Floyd before ultimately dealing on his neck for way too long and causing the death. So, long story short, I don't know how much that video had to play in the case of George Floyd's, or in the case of Derek Chauvin. I think you could say either one here, but anyway, But I would be interested to know what your thoughts are on something like that, and you can definitely let me know in the comment section or whatever, or join Discord, because I do think that there is a lot of questions to have on that particular topic. Now we're going to read a little bit more. The 12 juries and 2 alternatives were anonymous during the televised trial, and the jury was sequestered during deliberations. It's unclear whether any of the jurors plans to come forward publicly, but their identities could be released now that the trial is over. And then it goes on to say how much time they think Derek Chauvin is going to face. And we're going to read a little bit of this, and we're going to move on to our next article. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, whose office oversaw the prosecution, said Tuesday that prosecutors will seek a fair and just sentence. While the charges against Chauvin collectively amount to 75 years in prison, the judge must focus on the most serious charge of second-degree murder, which carries a maximum of 40 years behind bars. But Minnesota has sentencing guidelines that allow defendants like Chauvin with no criminal history to receive far less time. According to the guidelines, Chauvin need only to be sentenced for the most serious charge, since all the charges stem from the same act. But prosecutors have already signaled they will seek a harsher sentence, known as an upward departure. They plan to ask Hennepin County Judge Peter Shahill to consider aggravating factors, including that Floyd was particularly cruel and his death occurred in front of children as part of the sentencing decision. And the article goes on to talk about that and the process of George Floyd, that his lawyers will have about 60 days to put in their arguments for less time, and the legal procedure for how the sentencing is going to be done. But ultimately, I don't think that that is the most important thing, because we're just going to have to wait to see how long he would be sentenced for, and I'm not necessarily a legal expert to give my insight onto all of that process. But I have a thought. 1 second here. I'm going to go back down. Anyway, I forgot what I was going to say. But we'll go to our next article about basically what students had to say about Derek Chauvin. So the reason I kind of wanted to read a couple of these was to give the average youth thought of this trial and this event that happened, because you hear a lot from adults, especially if you're starting to follow any sort of media or anybody who's kind of talking about this event. But I was interested to read a little bit about what people more, I guess you could say, youth or my age thought about the situation. So we're just going to read a few reactions to the verdict. When the verdict was read to the public, I could hear the cheers and saw people hugging and crying. I can only imagine the bitter relief Floyd's loved ones felt after his murder was held accountable. There has been a charge in our community. People went from burning buildings to praying, with strangers awaiting the jury's decision. This horrible situation has brought the Minnesota community closer. It has made me realize that people can change when they are set on being heard peacefully, and for that, I am grateful. Next one. When I found out Derek Chauvin was guilty, I felt relieved, almost like a weight off my shoulders. In the media, you see how much bad news regarding police and black people, and now finally someone is held accountable. It still saddens me, and I think will forever be... This is a weird sentence. It still saddens me, and I think will forever sadden everyone, that our life had to be taken for justice to be served. I think they needed to run spell check there for a little bit, but maybe I'm just getting a little bit crazy here. Last one we'll read. This verdict, Derek Chauvin's trial, is one that many all over the world have celebrated. It serves as a reminder that together we can stand up to severe injustice we are surrounded by. Hearing that he was found guilty of all three charges was so liberating for me and many others. We have stood by this case for almost a year now, protesting and awaiting the day George Floyd is brought to justice, and it's finally come. So those are just some average thoughts of students I'm assuming probably college age or maybe high school age. Maybe the New York Times reached out to students in like middle school or something, but I'm assuming, judging from the replies, that it's probably high school, maybe college age students who submitted these replies to the New York Times. But a few of them caught my eye. And one of the things, and I want to make sure I mention it before we leave this topic, we have a couple more articles on it, but there was a lot of people who were outside of outside of the court itself, on the court steps and whatnot. So there was a lot of people that were waiting to hear this verdict, and there's a lot of people who had their mind set that if all three accounts weren't made, that there was going to be something wrong with the justice system. So long story short, there was a lot of pressure, you could argue, to have all three accounts. Now you could say that that's wrong or right, depending on what your views are, and ultimately I don't think that either person is 100% right on what I've heard from both sides of this. But then again, it just depends on the evidence and what happened, because the evidence was very strong against Derek Chauvin, especially for trying not to have all three accounts made for what happened. Now, one of the big things that came from this, and we slightly read it from the first statement of the student, was the media pressure for the Derek Chauvin's verdict. You had people like Joe Biden, where just after the verdict, he called George Floyd's parents. And before the verdict, he also called George Floyd's parents, and basically, without saying that he wanted Chauvin to be guilty on all three counts, he inferred very highly through saying that he was going to pray for the right decision. And a lot of people think that media figures like Joe Biden and shortly Maxine Waters, that we're about to listen to, should not be having public statements be said about them on an active trial. And even the judge basically said that Maxine Waters was being very dumb in what we're about to listen to, and the fact that media should not be involved in an active trial because it could have big influence to the people who are around this trial and ultimately to the jurors. Even though the jurors are supposed to not have any access to media while they're in the building, or access to media while they're outside of the court building for the days the trials happen, it's very hard to think that somebody's going to stay completely pure. And now you have to have 12 people that have to stay completely pure when it comes to media. And ultimately, that just doesn't really happen. And we see it in many cases. And that video I mentioned at the start of today's podcast, he also went on to say that when he was in solitary confinement, because he was a prisoner as well for many years, he would still be able to get information on news that was happening around the world and news that was happening inside the prison when he was in solitary confinement. And that is extremely more harsh than what the average juror has to go through, even on a high-profile case like this. So I do think that that needs to be talked about and needs to be said as well. Now we're going to go play the clip of Maxine Waters and what she had to say about this Derek Chauvin, and this was before the verdict was presented. Let me just skip to where it started. Make sure the volume's good. Alrighty, so this is going to be Maxine Waters and her statement she was saying about the trial of Derek Chauvin as it was happening.
now potentially affecting the case. Representative Maxine Waters making these comments about the trial.
I hope that we're going to get a verdict that is say guilty, guilty, guilty. And if we don't, we cannot go away. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business.
The judge denied a request.
I'm going to play it one more time because there's a lot of background noise so that maybe we can hear it a little bit better. And then we will continue on to my thoughts as I find the start of this clip again. All right, here we go.
Arrest now potentially affecting the case. Representative Maxine Waters making these comments about the trial.
I hope that we're going to get a verdict that is say guilty, guilty, guilty. And if we don't, we cannot go away. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business.
The judge.
We have to get guilty, guilty, guilty was what you said at first. Now, everybody's been talking that this trial, Derek Chauvin needed to get guilty, 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 because that was the only way that the justice system would be just. And once again, I do think that with all the evidence I have seen that Derek Chauvin was going to get guilty, guilty, guilty just because of the medical advice that was happened in the trial and the fact that they were able to play the video and the fact of several other claims, and ultimately the prosecution did an extremely good job at presenting their case. The defense didn't necessarily do a bad job, but the prosecution was much more emotional and much more just structured to where I think that they had, well, a stronger case. So, once again, I think that guilty, guilty, guilty was probably going to be the outcome of this trial, regardless of what you had as your evidence for going into the trial. Now, to what Maxine Waters said, so the fact that you said guilty, 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 whatever, sure, a lot of people have been saying it. Should a media figure like her, somebody that's in the governmental system, should be saying something like this? Well, no, not really. Is it bad? Not necessarily. Now, what she says next is more the claims on outright stupidity of Maxine Waters. If you're somebody that is Democratic leaning, you're somebody that is, let's just say Democratic leaning. You're somebody that from the very start, when you saw that video, no matter what other evidence came out through, George Floyd being on fentanyl or whatever, other evidence you want to say, you thought Chauvin should have been guilty on all three counts without question, period. You should be infuriated at Maxine Waters. Because what Maxine Waters said in her second part about if it doesn't happen, we will not leave and we will basically cause more violence is grounds to a potential mistrial or a potential retrial, an appeal of a trial. Derek Chauvin may be sentenced, but he may have a chance to get an appeal in a new trial to either shorten his sentence or maybe to outright leave from a non-guilty verdict or whatever. Like, again, I'm not a legal expert necessarily, but I know a lot of people were saying that what Maxine Waters said, although the judge did address it in his statement to the court before the verdict, while the trial was still happening, what we're shortly going to hear. But long story short, although the judge didn't say it was mistrial at that time, during the actual trial, there could be grounds to have a mistrial or an appeal trial for what Maxine Waters said because of the political impact that statement had. So if you're somebody Democratic leaning or somebody that wanted Chauvin to be guilty in all three accounts, regardless of whatever you think, and that's it, that's just in the statement, like I just said, you should be completely, extremely mad at Maxine Waters. But I'm going to play some of the rest of this clip about the judge here.
Denied a request for a mistrial over her comments, but says the defense may have grounds for appealing a guilty verdict later on.
I wish elected officials would stop talking about this case. Their failure to do so, I think, is abhorrent. but I don't think it has prejudiced us with additional material that would prejudice this jury. They have been told not to watch the news. I trust they are following those instructions.
So basically we just heard it from the judge. He went on a little bit more, but the video is not wanting to continue, so we'll just have to stop it here. But basically he was talking that he trusts the jury and the rules, that they can not watch the news and whatnot, as we just heard. And also that he wants the media to stop talking about trials as they're actively happening now, because in theory they could have an impact to the decision that the jury makes, especially when you're talking about something that has so much political charge to it. The death of George Floyd had an extremely high political charge and sparked a movement. The movement was already there, but it sparked this Black Lives Matter movement and justice movement and police reform movements, whatever, words you want to say. It sparked it to a whole nother level. And, yeah, so the fact that Maxine Waters potentially has given an appeal on the trial, potentially given a mistrial, whatever words you want to say, is something that should make people extremely mad, and something that media needs to be a lot more aware about. Because even if the jury's not supposed to be watching news, not supposed to be whatever, it's very hard to think that every jury member is going to follow the rules. Because when you tell someone, don't do this, what did they do? So, that's all I have to say there. But we're going to go to our article by New York Times, and then we have an article by, I believe, CNN on this very thing about Maxine Waters and the judge's comment. And this first one's by the New York Post. Judge in Derek Chauvin's trial says Maxine Waters' comments could lead to a whole case being overturned. The judge in Derek Chauvin's murder trial slammed Representative Maxine Waters' call for protests to get confrontational. If the ex-cop is cleared in the death of George Floyd, saying on Monday it could lead to a whole case being overturned. The stunning remarks came as the city of Minneapolis braces for unrest while the jury deliberates in the case. So once again, just to make this extra clear, she said these remarks as the jury was still in session for the trial and deliberating what charges they were going to decide on. This isn't afterwards, even though her statement wouldn't really make sense afterwards, but I just want to make that clear, that when she said these remarks was when the trial was physically happening. Defense attorney Eric Nelson had argued Hennepin County District Judge Peter Cowell to declare a mistrial, arguing that an elected official, U.S. Congressperson, made statements that I think are reasonably interpreted to be threats against the sanctity of the jury process, and had the effect of threatening and intimidating the jury. Kilhay denied the motion, but told Nelson, I will give you that Congressman Waters may have given you something on the pill that may result in this whole trial being overturned. This goes back to what I'm saying from the beginning. Judge fumed, I wish elected officials would stop talking about the case, especially in a murder that is disrespectful to the whole rule of law and the judicial branch and our function. I think they want to give their opinion. They should do so in a respectful and in a manner that is consistent with their oath to the Constitution to respect a co-equal branch of government, he said. Their failure to do so, I think, is abhorrent, but I don't think it's perjured us with an additional material that would produce this jury. I don't know if I said that right, but we'll go on. So there we see it from the judge in his remarks against Maxine Waters, and part of the statements that the video didn't really want to play for some reason, but we read them here, so you have now heard what the judge had to say on that event. CNN here has an article from Maxine Waters in her statement that what she said against Derek Chauvin in the trial are said against... Let's restart. CNN has an article here of Waters saying that the judge in Derek Chauvin's trial who criticized the protest remarks was angry and frustrated and weren't really grounds to a mistrial or anything like that. We are going to... Alright. Representative Maxine Waters. Ooh, hang on a second. We got a technical issue. So I don't know ultimately what you would say, audience here, about Maxine Waters, but I don't think that what she did was particularly smart at all by any means. Now you could say that really what she said doesn't really have grounds for anything. I mean, it's just a political person, that it's not going to have any impact on the jury. The jury's supposed to not follow the news, blah, 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 blah. But I'm not sure if that's really the case, because it's almost a too true to be truthful type of statement. So yeah, but we'll read what the CNN article has to say here. Representative Maxine Waters on Saturday called the judge overseeing former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin's trial in the case of George Floyd angry and frustrated in response to his recent criticism that her comments at a protest could be grounds for appealing a verdict. This is her statement here. I think he was angry. I think he may be frustrated with the case and how much word publicity is on it and all of that, Waters told CNN Jim Acosta on Newsroom. Waters last weekend ahead of the verdict in the case had called for protesters to stay on the street and get more confrontational. If Chauvin were acquitted in Floyd's killings, comments immediately seized on by Republicans who claimed that Waters was inciting violence. The California Democrat said she was in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, to show her support for protesters in ongoing protests over the police killing of Daunte Wright, and to also his supporters to his family. And we're going to get to Daunte Wright here soon. Many people on the right side of content creators on YouTube, Twitch, whatever you want to say, are ultimately saying that Maxine Waters' claims to incite violence are to incite a more violent protest or bigger protest, are bigger claims than what happened at the Capitol building on that extremely bad day. Now, I don't really think that they're being super truthful on what they have to say about that. But I do think that that needs to be mentioned as well, because the fact that she said that they need to get more confrontational if the verdict turns out wrong is obviously something that I think we need to be discussing and talking about, because Maxine Waters and what she did just doesn't make any sense at all. It's completely dumb. And in the worst case, she's now given Derek Chauvin the chance to have a lesser sentence or not a sentence at all. And on the best chance, she now looks incredibly stupid. So, in somewhere in between is probably going to be what happens, like always in politics. But that's all I kind of wanted to talk about with Maxine Waters, but I do think it needed to be brought up, and people and the impact that politicians, government officials, the President of the United States could have on the jury making their decision, even if the jury isn't supposed to be following news or learning information about anything related to the trial from outside sources, like friends or whatever the case might be. This next one I thought was a little bit interesting. We're not going to read too much about it, but I do think it needs to be talked about a little bit. But this is by AP News, and their headline states here, one verdict, then 6 police killings across America in 24 hours. Even as the Derek Chauvin case was fresh in memory, the reading of the verdict in a Minneapolis courtroom, the shackling of the former police officer, the jubilation as what many saw as justice in the death of George Floyd. Even then, blood flowed on American streets. and even then, some of that blood was shed at the hands of law enforcement. At least 6 people were fatally shot by officers across the United States in 24 hours after juries reached a verdict in the murder case against Chauvin on Tuesday. The roll call of the death is distressing. A 16-year-old Columbus, Ohio, an off-to-arrest man in California, a 42-year-old man in North Carolina. The deaths in some cases sparked a new crisis for justice. Some said they reflect an urgent need for radical changes to American policing, a need that the Chauvin verdict cannot paper over. For others, the shooting are a tragic reminder of the difficult and dangerous decisions law enforcement face daily. An unidentified man in San Antonio, another man killed in the same city within hours, a 34-year-old man in central Massachusetts, and it states that all of these circumstances and killings were different, but there were a lot police killings just after the verdict of the trial of Derek Chauvin. I'm going to wait to see all of the evidence behind the shootings and before I ultimately say a final statement on all of these. But I do think it is very important to note that there were a significant number of deaths following the verdict of George Floyd, where all of them, it seems like too high of a number for every shooting to be for lack of better words, justified if there was a self-defense case for the police officer, since the number is that great. Yeah. So I don't really have too much to say, but I do think it needed to be talked about because it does seem like there could be a lot of potential police anger at the verdict of Derek Chauvin, because generally the police protect the police, and there's been an average claim that one of the big reasons that police system is broken and why police reform needs to happen is because when something bad happens in the police system, in a police department, the people that investigate the police is the police. So they never really ultimately solve an issue. They just more kind of brush it behind and go on with their day. So a lot of times the police protect the police, and the police feel that it's their responsibility to protect their brothers of police officers. So that was why it was super huge to see the police chief in the Derek Chauvin case testify against Derek Chauvin and not testify, I guess you could say, with Derek Chauvin. So I think that is kind of interesting, and it may suggest that there could be potential anger within a lot of police systems in the verdict of Derek Chauvin. Now, without looking into all of the killings, I can't necessarily say that that is a truthful statement, but the number does seem a little bit high to suggest that all of the shootings were justified, even though just saying that seems very harsh as well, because you could say that any police shooting is not justified. I think that would just depend on the facts of what happened in that particular case. But anyway, we're going to move on to our next article here. Oops, wrong thing. Waiting for the article to load up here. This is the FedEx shooting. This happened a couple weeks ago, but I thought I wanted to at least talk about it a little bit because there were some interesting facts that came out of this shooting and came out of grounds and people who are testifying against certain laws with guns and who should be able to have guns. Should there be red flag laws? Should there be anti-large weapons or assault rifles or things like that? So anyway, we're going to read into our next article here by CNN. This is what we know about the shooting at an Indianapolis FedEx facility. And this was an article at the time, April 17th, is when it was written. So about a week ago from the recording of this podcast. Authorities were on the scene of yet another mass shooting, this time at the FedEx ground facility in Indianapolis, where 8 people were killed Friday. The shooter is also dead. Police said Deputy Chief Greg McCart of the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department said in a news conference Friday that investigation is still very much in its infancy and there are still questions investigators are working to answer. What happened? Gunfire erupted at a facility not far from the Indianapolis International Airport late Thursday when a gunman got out of his car and pretty quickly started some random shootings outside the facility, McCart said. That began in the parking lot, and then he did go into the building, into a facility for a brief period of time. According to McCart, investigations have heard the shooting lasted just a couple of minutes. Police were called to the facility at about 11 p.m. According to what McCart told CNN, was a very chaotic scene with victims and witnesses running everywhere. By the time officers entered the facility, McCart said at a news conference the situation was over. The gunman had taken his own life shortly before officers entered, and no officers fired their weapons, he said. They found several victims injured and several victims deceased, as well as the suspect who was deceased, as well of an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. The deputy chief added nothing had apparently precipitated the gunfire. No confrontations or disturbances, no arguments. He just appeared to randomly start shooting. It was at least the 45th mass shooting reported in the United States since March 16th. CNN defines a mass shooting as an incident that results in 4 or more casualties, dead or wounded, excluding the shooter. It's funny that they have that as a condition as well, with excluding the shooter, because a lot of times with mass shootings, the shooter themselves ends up killing themselves afterwards. Anyway. The victims. 8 people were killed according to the police. 4 were found outside the facility, and another 4 were found inside the building. On Friday evening, Indianapolis police released the names of the victims. Matthew R. Alexander, Samaria Blackwell, Amirjit Johu, I hope I pronounced that right. Kaar, looks like they're brothers? Yes. And a few others. 4 of those killed were Sikh members. A member of the Sikh, I think it's called Sikh, community in Indianapolis told CNN the community has grown in Indiana in recent years. According to the coalition, the state's first Gurdwara was established in 1999, so it talks a little bit about the Sikh movement. We go on to the suspect here. The police identified the gunman as 19-year-old, I'm not going to say the name, was a former police officer at the facility and had last been employed there in 2020. Previously, FedEx declined to name him, but spokesperson Jim confirmed the gunman had previously worked at a facility where the shooting took place. FBI Special Agent in Charge Paul Kenyai said the FBI assisted Indianapolis police investigators with the search of the man's house. The gunman had at least 1 weapon, said McCart told CNN, and a man was believed to have been carrying a rifle of some sort during the shooting. His mother told the law enforcement in March 2020 he might try to attempt suicide by cop, the FBI Indianapolis office said in a statement. He was placed on immediate detention mental health temporary hold by Indianapolis police, Canone said in a statement, and a shotgun was seized at his home. Based on these items observed, the suspect's bedroom at the time, he was interviewed by the FBI in April 2020, the statement said. No racially motivated violent extremism ideology was identified, during the course of the assessment, and no criminal violation was found. The shotgun was not returned to the suspect. We're going to go down to what CNN thinks the motive was here, and it states here, the motive remains unknown. But now that the gunman has been identified, McCart said investigators can start to explore a potential motive. We have recently identified him, so now the work really begins trying to establish some of that and see if we can figure out some sort of motive in this. But we don't have that right now, he said. Last Friday morning, about a motive, Kenai said it would be premature to speculate on motivation. So that was the article written at the time of this mass shooting at the FedEx facility that happened about a week ago. We're going to go to this Politico article where it states the FBI says it interviewed FedEx mass shooter last year. The former employee was shot and killed. 8 people at the FedEx facility in Indianapolis was interviewed by FBI agents last year. After his mother called police, we just read about that. McCart said that the slayings took place in a matter of minutes, and there were at least 100 people in the facility at the time. Many were changing shifts or were on their dinner breaks, he said. Several people were wounded, including 5 who were taken to the hospital. You deserved so much better than this, a man who identified himself as the grandson of Joel tweeted Friday evening. Joel had planned to work a double shift Thursday so she could take Friday off, according to the grandson, who would not give his full name but identifies himself as Kamal. On his Twitter page, Joel later decided to grab her check and go home, and still had the check in her hand when the police found her. What a harsh and cruel world we live in. Smith, the youngest of the victims, was last in contact with her family shortly before 11 p.m. Thursday, a family member said in social media post last Friday, Smith's sister waited hours at a Holiday Inn for an update on her sister. Words can't even explain how I feel. I am so hurt, he said in a Facebook post. President Joe Biden said he had been briefed on the shooting and called the gun violence an epidemic in the U.S., which obviously it is. I don't think we necessarily need to say that. Now, why it is, there's many answers and many questions too. But we are looking for the statement about the FBI. This article looks very similar to the one before. Yeah, this article didn't really give answers to what I wanted. So we're gonna go to our next one here. Okay. So we'll just go to our next one. I'm not sure why that didn't want to come up. This next one is the killing or shooting of Daunte Wright. That is a more recent killing by a police officer at a routine traffic stop. This one is extremely aggravating. To say it in very shortly, the short terms. I'll describe in a short timeline, and then we can get into our articles here about the event. But basically, there was a routine traffic stop of Daunte Wright because the vehicle was not identified as a vehicle that he should have been driving. In other words, the vehicle was stolen. And there was believed to be numerous other things to why the police may have pulled that vehicle over. So the vehicle gets pulled over, the police officers get out and kind of do their traditional, one person on this side, one person on this side. Hey, can you do this? Blah, 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 blah. I need your insurance, blah, 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 blah. Routine traffic stop. Now, Daunte Wright seemed in the videos, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to play the video because Twitch won't allow the video to be played. And frankly, since it's a podcast, you won't be able to see the video either for when this goes into audio. But you can definitely find the video on YouTube and other places on news articles and whatnot, and you can watch it all yourself. But long story short, the officer ended up shooting Daunte Wright as he was trying to drive off from not wanting to be arrested by police. Now, why he wanted to drive out and not be arrested by police can be a question, but it's not ultimately the main question we want to be answered when it comes to the Daunte Wright case. And there's been claims that the officer mistaked a taser for a gun, and that it sounds very weird to say that you could mistake a taser to a gun. If you go back to some YouTubers that I've listened to and some articles that I've read that are more, you could say, right-leaning perspective, could say that in the heat of the moment, somebody could accidentally mistake their taser for a gun because it is in the heat of the moment, so to speak, and they may not necessarily think otherwise. Many people point out to the factor that a gun and a taser are supposed to be on different sides of the hips to prevent the draw of the gun instead of the draw of the taser, or a draw of a taser when you actually need a gun. I think it could go both ways in this case. Anyway, you get what I'm saying. So there's been many claims that is what ultimately happened for Daunte Wright, but there just seems to be very odd that the events of what happened in this case and why Daunte Wright ended up being shot. There's some police stations, some police officers, I guess you could say, some police stations say that you're able to shoot a car if that person is violent and you think that that person needs to be stopped rather than risk the chance of getting away. I don't think that person ultimately is Daunte Wright, really. I don't think he was somebody of that high profile of a case to have been shot, because the chance of him getting away is more of a threatening case than him not. Some police stations say that you're not able to shoot a moving car no matter what because it's a moving car. And ultimately, if you do shoot and kill the driver, the car is still moving. So that could be a potential risk, a potential weapon really, to kill somebody else or to cause harm to property or whatever the case may be. But we're going to read our first article by NPR talking about the officer that ended up shooting Daunte Wright. Because in the clip, you can hear her say, shit, I fired the wrong weapon. I shot him, is what you said. I shot him, not with the taser, but with the gun. So she quickly realized what she did. And ultimately, she ended up turning herself in to the police station, and now she's definitely going to be facing charges. And many people are debating on what charges she is going to end up going away with. Because was this intentional? Was this not intentional? Did she mean to cause the death? Did she not mean to cause the death? Blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of legal questions that are going to have to be answered when it comes to this case of Daunte Wright. But I highly encourage you to watch the video that you can find on some YouTube and some articles about the video. I do have the video linked in the channel description. I just unfortunately can't play it, and it's not really going to play very well because this is a podcast as well. But the video does give a very good, it gives you what happened, and it's a lot easier to watch the video than to try to explain what happened. So if this is something that interests you, or you just want to know kind of what I'm talking about, you can definitely watch the video, and that will probably clear up any of your questions when it comes to this case. Our first article here is by NPR. Officer who killed Daunte Wright makes first court appearance in manslaughter case. The former Brooklyn Center, Minneapolis police officer charged in the killing of Daunte Wright made their first appearance in court Thursday as members of the Wright family continued their call for consequences. Police officials said Kim Porter, a 48-year-old white woman, mistook her handgun for her taser. When she fatally shot Wright, a 20-year-old black man, on Sunday. In body camera footage, Potter can be heard yelling taser just before shooting him. And it is actually policy. Before you shoot someone with a taser, when you have a bunch of police around that person, you're supposed to yell that you're about to use your taser so that you end up not shooting one of your officers with the taser. I think that kind of makes sense, but I just wanted to describe that just so we're on the same page here. The Washington County Attorney Office has charged Porter with second-degree manslaughter. She faces a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. Potter was arrested Wednesday and released later that day after posting a $100,000 bond. She is being represented by Earl Gray, a high-profile Minneapolis defense attorney who had represented multiple police officers, and former Vikings quarterback Daunte Kopler. One of his current clients is Thomas Lane, a former Minneapolis police officer who helped restrain George Floyd. Thursday court appearance was brief and conducted via Zoom. Her next appearance has been scheduled for May 17th in person. The case has been assigned to Hennepin County Judge Regine Chu. Meanwhile, at a church in North Indianapolis, members of the Wright family and their attorney, Benjamin Crump, hold a press conference where they continue to demand consequences for Porter. They also laminated their son's name, joining those of other black men killed by police officers in encounters that began over seemingly minor transgressions, such as Eric Garner selling loose cigarettes and Floyd using a suspected counterfeit $20 bill. So in other words, what they're saying here is the police seem to be wanting to take things to a much more violent route than necessarily need to be. George Floyd was initially going to be arrested partly because of his purchase of using a $20 counterfeit bill. And in the case that we just read here, such as Eric Garner being arrested for the selling of loose cigarettes, which you're not allowed to do under laws and regulations for the government and whatnot. But ultimately, they're saying that the police are more than willing to escalate things to a much more violent route than necessarily they need to be doing. So therefore, because police are willing to arrest people for crimes that probably don't really necessarily need to be arrested for, or at least can be done so in a lot less aggressive manner, they're causing multiple more deaths and multiple more injuries of people that probably don't really necessarily need to be arrested. If you were to ask somebody, do you think somebody should be arrested for the use of a $20 bill, you'd probably get them a decent amount of percentage of people that say, no, I don't really think so. So that's kind of a question about that. They get no due process. They didn't get to have the officers come before the court of law and have the witnesses and evidence presented to a jury to make a determination. Crump has represented more than a dozen families in high-profile police brutality cases, many of which did not result in charges for the officers involved. He said the manslaughter charge against Porter was evidence of a charge coming to America. Daunte Wright did not get a chance in an arrest of the officer that shot and killed him, he said. So we are making progress, and I want to encourage those protesting, those young people, those activists, that you are making a difference. So the article goes on to talk a little bit more about the claims that the defense was making. Actually, no, would it be Daunte Wright's family was making? Let me just say that. But I don't want to confuse the terminology here. So this is talking about the taser and handgun argument, the Glock versus taser. Because when you think of what a taser looks like, there's a reason that a taser is supposed to be usually in yellow and have some black on it, but the large amount of the taser is yellow, and that is to have another barrier to know what weapon you are using. Because a taser is supposed to look extremely more different than a handgun or a gun itself is supposed to look. That's why on fake guns you have the orange cap at the end of the gun. That's to represent that this gun is a toy and not a gun. Now for the case of the taser is yellow and a different shape kind of to a gun rather than a basic Glock that the police station was using for that police station. But I believe a lot of the police stations use the same sort of handgun, but I'm not 100% certain on that. But police officers do carry a handgun on them, so it's going to be some sort of a handgun, and certain officers are able to have a taser as well. And this is by USA Today. Lethal force. Tasers are meant to save lives, yet hundreds die after the use by police. The fatal shooting this month by Daunte Wright by Minneapolis patrol officer who allegedly confused her pistol for a taser had every appearance of a freak accident. Tasers are designed as a non-lethal weapon, a tool for law enforcement to safely subdue non-compliant suspects. Had Officer Kim Porter drawn an intended weapon and tased Wright instead of shooting him, the 20-year-old black man might still be alive. Yet Porter's mistake was no anomaly. It's part of the problem. It's part of a pattern of sloppy, reckless, and deadly use of a weapon involved in hundreds of deaths, injuries in the past decade because of the sustained or inconsistent training for law enforcement. An investigation by USA Today and the Armart Center for Investigative Journalism at the Indiana University found. Officers in many cases defied best practices recommended by device manufacturers and sidestepped basic use of force protocols. In July 2013, a Chicago police officer tased a pregnant woman 3 times, including once in the abdomen, after she pretended to use her cell phone to record authorities towing her van. She miscarried her baby. 4 years later, 2 Arlington, Texas police officers fired a taser at a 39-year-old suicidal man after watching him dose himself with gasoline. The electricity currents immediately set Gabriel Olives aflame and burned his house. Wow. That's a little harsh. Wow. 2 years later, the Louisiana State Troopers tased 49-year-old Ronald Greene at least 3 times in 20 seconds after he failed to stop his car for unspecified traffic violation. Police initially told Greene's family he died from crash injuries, but a medical report noted that his bruised and bloody body also had 2 taser probes still lodged in his back. Such ingredients highlight a lack of uniform state or national standards for the use of conducted energy weapons like tasers and comprehensive training for officers who wield them. No federal agencies track how many people are killed or seriously injured following a taser use by law enforcement officers, nor how many departments are equipped with the devices, and no one keeps tabs on how many law enforcement agencies adopted dozens of safety guidelines recommended by device manufacturers and other police training organizations. I actually looked into this claim because I was a little bit interested, and one of the things that came up was certain police departments, because of the recent statistical increase of the use of tasers and the wrongful use of tasers, are requiring only a certain percentage of their officers to have tasers through how many years they've been in law enforcement or their police officer rank or whatever you want to ultimately say. So there's a lot of police departments that have their entry-level policemen or their couple year policemen people not have tasers because of the increase in wrongful use of a taser. So I think that's kind of interesting. It'll be interesting to read a little bit more out of what comes from the trial for Porter in the case of Daunte Wright and see what outcome happens and to see if the defense is able to prove that the mistake of using the taser actually happened and it wasn't just a... basically to see just how good that claim is going to be in the court of law. Because I'm kind of curious to see what a lot of people think about that. Because there's been a lot of memes online or a lot of pictures online that have a taser and a Glock next to each other. And they're like, how can you mistake these two weapons from each other? Or these two weapons from each other. One is yellow, one is black, one looks like this, one looks like that. How in the world can you mix it up? So I'm interested to see where all that goes as far as tasers. Now we're going to go to our next topic here. We'll take a quick drink break before we move on. One thing I thought was rather interesting as far as recent news was the factor of President Biden. And you might be saying, well, what am I wanting to talk about with President Biden? There's been a lot of stuff since we last went on podcast. There's been a month between episode 22 and episode 23. So what in particular am I wanting to talk about when it comes to President Biden? Well, one thing that rather interests me is not so much that what's happening in the United States itself. Obviously, that is important, and I know a lot more about U.S. politics than any other international politics system because I live in the U.S., and I follow a lot of content creators, and I read a lot of news, blah, 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 so I know a lot about U.S. politics. But in recent news, there's been a little bit of a feud between President Putin and President Biden. Putin being the Russian president, obviously. And right now, they're in a little bit of a war of sanctions. And Biden recently moved troops closer to Russia and closer to Ukraine and whatnot because of what Russia did. Because Russia recently had a trading exercise of troops that were within the Russian border but very close to Ukraine. And those that don't know a lot about Russia politics or anything like that, and I'm not no expert or anything, but long story short, Russia wants Ukraine to be a part of Russia. And Russia thinks that Ukraine should be a part of Russia. And Ukraine doesn't want to be a part of Russia. They want it to be their own place. So, and Putin has stressed that he wants Ukraine to be a part of Russia. So there's always a potential for war between Russia and Ukraine to for who's going to be that nation. Is it going to be Ukraine, or is Russia going to become Ukraine? You get what I'm saying. So recently, Russia did a military exercise a little bit close to Ukraine's border, and Biden kind of saw it as a little bit of a move he didn't necessarily really like, because the United States does have a lot of soldiers that would be willing to back Ukraine in this battle. And it will be interesting if this war were to ultimately happen because of NATO forces and war alliances between the war alliances that happened after World War II and whatnot. Like, again, I don't know a whole lot about world politics and international politics, but I do know enough to know a little bit about what's happening. But right now, there's big news about emergency sanctions and basically Russia and the United States cutting off a lot of trade between the nations. I still think that some trade is happening, but I think it's been a lot more minimized between the two nations. And there's potential that the nations could go to war if things were to get worse. Now, is it going to happen? Probably not, because of mutually assured destruction or MAD, because of nuclear weapons and whatnot, and a World War III is probably looking less and less and less likely to ultimately happen. But the fact that that could happen is still something that a lot of people who follow international politics and are interested into international politics are thinking about. But we're going to read here from Fox News. Biden declares Russia threat national emergency, lob sanctions, 10 diplomats booted over election meddling. President Biden on Thursday signed an executive order declaring a national emergency over the threat from Russia as his administration slapped new sanctions on the country. The U.S. Department of State said it's expelling 10 officials from Russia mission. Today was announced actions to hold the Russian government accountable for solar wind intrusion, reports to the boundaries of the U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, and attempts to interfere in the 2020 U.S. elections. It's the Secretary of State Attorney Blickman said in a statement. The White House also released a letter to Congress stating that the president had issued an executive order declaring a national emergency with respect to the unusual and extraordinary threat to national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States posed by specific harmful foreign activities of the government of Russia Federation. The letter said that Russia had undermine the conduct of free and fair democratic elections, engaged in malicious cyber-enabled activities, targeted journalism and the centers outside of its borders, and violated international law. This, Biden said in a letter, constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. Blickman's statements went into more detail, citing not only CyberWind's hack that compromised many agencies in the federal government, but also poisoning of top Putin political rival Alexei Navalny. We remain concerned about Navalny's health and treatment in prison and call for his unconditional release, Blickman said. Navalny is currently in the custody of Russian government and reported not to be well. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki previously said that the Russian government is responsible for his health and well-being. Blickman also emphasized Thursday, however, that the United States will seek opportunities for cooperation in the goal of building a more stable and predictable relationship with U.S. interest. And goes on to talk a little bit more, but we have one more article talking about this whole Russia versus Biden thing. And we'll continue on. Politico. Biden sanctions Russia, expels Democrats over election interference. The moves are part of an intensifying U.S. campaign to punish Moscow over its attempts to interfere in the 2020 U.S. election. Its cyber espionage campaign that used a company called Solar Winds, its occupation of Crimea, and other Malian actions. They are sure to. The new penalties also follow a Tuesday conversation between Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin, during which Biden proposed the two meet in a third country in the coming months. A senior administrative official told reporters on Thursday that Biden previewed U.S. actions to Putin during the call, and that Russia, both publicly and in other formats, had indicated they intended to respond. The U.S., of course, reserves the right to take further action as necessary, the officials said, but our views is the best course forward at this point would be for the U.S. and Russia both to get off the ladder of escalation and find a stable way forward. Biden reprimanded the statement Tuesday afternoon in brief remarks at the White House, describing their conversation between the two as candid and respectful. He added that the U.S. wanted to work with Russia where it could, but would not be afraid to stand up in the country when necessary. Biden said he also invited Putin to a potentially summit this summer in Europe, a possibility their teams are currently discussing. I was clear with the President Putin, we could have gone further, but I choose not to do so. I chose to be proportionate, he said, about the new actions. The United States is not looking to kick off a cycle of escalation and conflict with Russia. We want a stable and predictable relationship. The Russian Foreign Ministry suggested that Biden was not sincere about any overturns to Moscow. The U.S. is not ready to put up the objective reality of a multipolar war, he said in a tweet. So it's kind of interesting that Biden wanted to call an emergency on Russia, and now in this article he seems to be backing down a little bit, and previous Russian leaders, if you follow history a little bit, were a little bit timid to go into as much of a war to the United States as Putin appears to be willing to. I suggest listening to another podcast by Scott Horton on his show. You could just search Scott Horton's name on Apple Podcasts and you'll find one of his more recent episodes, probably the third or fourth episode by the time you're listening to this, where he talked about Russia and Biden and what his thoughts were on this whole situation. He had a lot of insight that I didn't really necessarily was too much aware of. But one of the things he kind of talked about was he says that Putin doesn't appear to be a world leader that is going to back down to the United States. So if the United States decides to do something, Russia appears to be more likely to counter what the United States does or to do something back at the United States. And that could ultimately escalate to a war if Biden isn't careful with what he decides to do, because Putin, in his mind, does appear to be more willing to do something than previous leaders. Anyway, I suggest listening to that podcast if you want more reliable international news or an insight that may be a little bit more different than what you typically think about when you think about world politics in the United States versus Russia. So this next one I thought was kind of funny. On the podcast, you aren't going to be able to see it. I just have a picture up for those who are listening to live now. But recently, all the world leaders, or a majority of world leaders, went on a Zoom call where they were discussing climate change. And this was everyone from Russia, Turkey, Italy, Canada, European, Denmark, Vietnam, Norway, France. Just these whole bunch of world countries got together for this climate meeting, and Biden was the only person wearing the mask during the Zoom meeting. So a lot of times Biden's blamed for being very politician-y. He does something to look like he is pro us as Americans, or pro us as Americans. Virtue signaling, that's the word I'm looking for. Biden is a very virtue signaling person. He wants you to think that he is the best and you should trust him. And I'm doing this to show Americans that you need to react like I do. You need to do what I do. I'm the president. You should be looking for me to figure out what to do in your life. And when it comes to COVID-19, he has been one to always be seen wearing a mask and lead by example, I guess what you could say. So if I'm wearing the mask, you should wear a mask. And recently, this was kind of funny, and many people just see this as a total virtual signaling because Biden was the only person during a Zoom call, not a conference where they're all together, but during a Zoom call where Biden was the only one wearing a mask on a virtual conference. So that is just kind of funny. And I thought we would talk a little bit about that, especially since we just talked about Russia and their claims of sanctions against each other. If that doesn't make you laugh, then I don't know what is going to make you laugh. That's all I have to say on that. We just need a little bit of break. Now we'll get into our last major topic here, and that is Biden's immigration policy. Biden's immigration policy, since the last time we've talked last month, has come under attack because of its very harsh conditions. Trump put people in cages. It was started by Obama, even though you saw pictures of cages that Trump put people in cages, blah, blah, blah. A lot of people were on Republican side were saying that they were Obama's cages. You should blame Obama, not Trump. But regardless of what you think, Trump was the one that put them in cages. So if you want to blame why they're in cages, you need to blame Trump. Even if he didn't necessarily start the cage policy, he still continued it, or at least updated it to his version of what happened. Now it's Biden's turn for immigration, and Biden has a very more open immigration policy compared to Donald Trump. Donald Trump, complete opposite to Biden when it comes to immigration, for sure. But Biden recently has come under attack for his harsh conditions and families, children, people being in cages still. And they're not letting media figures or politicians or anybody into these facilities where media would be able to tell the public at how their children or how the border is treating these people who are illegal aliens or trying to get into the country. Trying to get into the United States. So because of that, there's been a lot of pictures. There's been, well, not really necessarily pictures. Well, there actually has been some pictures that I've seen, even though I'm not necessarily sure how they were able to get pictures, because I know that Biden wasn't allowing media into these facilities. But we're going to watch a little bit of a video here shortly about Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham, who about 2 weeks ago went to the border. I tried to go to the border and address situations of border security and border conditions under Biden's presidency. But I thought we would first start by this Pew Research Center article where it talks about a few facts of U.S. immigration policies and Biden's proposed changes. And this was on March 22nd when the article was written. The Biden administration is acting on a number of fronts to reverse Trump-era restrictions on immigration to the United States. These steps include plans to boost refugee admissions, preserving deportation relief for unauthorized immigrants who come to the U.S. as children, and not enforcing the public charge rule that denies green cards to immigrants who might use public benefits like Medicaid. President Joe Biden has also President Biden has also lifted restrictions established early in the coronavirus pandemic. They drastically reduced the number of visas issued to immigrants. The number of people who received a green card declined from about 236,000 in the second quarter of the 2020 fiscal year, January to March, to under 78,000 in the third quarter, April to June. By comparison, the third quarter of the fiscal 2019 is nearly 266,000 people who received a green card. Biden's biggest immigration proposal to date would allow more new immigrants into the U.S. while giving millions of unauthorized immigrants who are already in the country a pathway to legal status. The expensive legislation would create an 8-year path to citizenship for the nation's estimated 10.5 million unauthorized immigrants, update the existing family based on immigration system, revise revise employment-based visa rules, and increase the number of diversity visas. By contrast, the Trump administration sought to restrict legal immigration in a variety of ways, including through legislation that would have overhauled the nation's legal immigration system by sharply reducing family-based immigration. Overall, more than 35 million lawful immigrants live in the U.S. Most are American citizens. Many live and work in a country after being granted lawful permanent residence. Others will receive temporary visas available to students and workers. In addition, roughly 1 million unauthorized immigrants have temporary permission to live and work in the U.S. through the Defend Action for Childhood Arrivals and Temporary Protected Status programs. So one thing here you might be asking already is who was ultimately going to pay for the healthcare of these, as they say, unauthorized immigrants or illegal aliens or whatever terminology you want to ultimately use. Because cost is something that is greatly high. And if you are going to have a more open border approach or open border style, you have to still be able to address the situation of who is going to pay for certain policies. If you want to have open borders and free healthcare for everyone, or open borders and healthcare for illegal aliens or unauthorized Americans, or whatever you want to ultimately say, there's going to come at a great cost. And the cost is something that a lot of people are concerned about. And that is why Trump ran on border security rather than open border. Because it's kind of a funny sort of issue. Because especially with borders, no matter what side you take on the border, you have a very passionate crowd. And you have two very big crowds of people that are going to support you. You have the people that want the border completely closed and basically want to take care of us themselves and not worry about any other person that wants to come to America. And you have the other side that wants America to be America, wants America to be open, wants it to be inviting, wants it to be everyone to have a chance to come to America in an open border society. And if you take either one of those stances, you're going to have a huge number of people that are going to support you for your border policy. But you're still going to have to address where ultimately the money is going to come from when it comes to immigration in the United States through green cards or through crossing the border illegally or whatever terminology there. Because refugees, that's another thing. Refugees and illegal aliens are different as well, so we also need to be thinking about those claims as well. Although I don't think that refugee numbers are ultimately as big as numbers of people just willing to cross the border for a potential at a better chance for life for their children or life for themselves. But the Pew Research that goes on to talk a lot more about the numbers and people who are on certain programs that are trying to get into the United States. So if you are interested in that, you can find it in the channel description on YouTube or in my Discord server where I will post all of these articles. But Stephen Miller recently had an attack on Biden's immigration policy. And this is by the Washington Post, and we are going to be reading about that. Under normal administrations, whether it was Obama's administration, the Trump administration, the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, if a criminal alien was arrested by a local sheriff department and police department, state trooper, state police, highway patrol, they were flagged by ICE. Something called a detainer was issued, and when the person was released, whether they were bonded out by a judge, whether they were put on their own recognized pending trial, or whether they completed the prison sentence, they were placed into ICE custody. The Biden administration has stopped doing that in the vast majority of cases. So all of these criminal offenders are now being released back into the U.S. population, back into your communities, back into your schools, back near the places where you live. The result of that is going to be a massive amounts of recidivism. Innocent people are going to get hurt. Innocent people are going to get killed. Innocent people are going to suffer irreparable damages as a result of that decision. Stephen Miller, advisor to former President Donald Trump, in an interview on Sunday morning on Fox News, stated, just to make sure everybody's aware, recidivism is the word used for people who go back to prison after already have been in prison before. And the American justice system has an extremely high recidivism rate, meaning that people are willing to commit a crime again after already have been in that prison system. But we'll read a little bit more to see what the Washington Post have to say about this. After 4 years in the White House as Trump immigration advisor, Miller is now on the outside looking in as President Biden winds down on many of his policies. Biden pledged to reverse Trump's signature immigration controls as the travel ban covering several minority Muslim countries and the rename in Mexico. Policy that turned away asylum seekers from Central America and to stop construction of Trump's southern border barrier. Biden also planned a 100-day moratorium on deportations, and although a federal judge ruled to stop the freeze, federal data as mid-April shows the U.S. immigration officials have been taken into custody far fewer unauthorized migrants from the interior of the United States. Innocent people are going to get killed, Miller said on Fox News, claiming that the Biden administration has stopped issues detaining requests to local authorities in the vast majority of cases. These dire warnings were the typical rhetoric of the Trump administration, even though research studies constantly disprove a link between immigrants and higher crime. Keep in mind that Miller talks about undocumented migrants going back into your communities, back into your schools. Arrests of migrants and deportees have declined sharply under Biden and the new administration. Policy is to focus on violent criminals, gang members, and national security threats. Miller didn't mention that on Fox News. He failed to mention that these arrests fell sharply under Trump beginning in April 2020, after the federal government adopted coronavirus safety protocols. Excuse me. Miller implied the U.S. immigration officials had the same tracking system in place from when Clinton through Trump administrators, when in fact the government's technology capabilities and enforcement policies have changed drastically from each presidency to the next. And it talks a little bit about if that facts of what Miller said was true for or not. And ultimately, I think it will depend on what statistics you're ultimately thinking about and how you ultimately view the role illegal immigrants have in your society. But that was all I kind of wanted to mention on that, because Biden is getting some severe backlash from former Trump officials and former people that valued Trump's immigration style, are people that think that Biden is going for too big of an open border. We have here, this is by Politico, Trump group teams with Texans and challenge to Biden immigration policies. Former Trump administration officials joined with the state of Texas to file a federal lawsuit on Thursday alleging that President Joseph Biden administration is defying the law and putting Americans at heightened risk of coronavirus infection by continuing to allow some immigrants who illegally crossed the border with Mexico to be released into the U.S. America's First Legal Foundation, a new nonprofit group funded by Trump's advisor Stephen Miller, is serving as an outside counsel to Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton on a suit filed in federal court in Fort Worth. The suit seeks to give immigration advocates and Biden administrative officials a taste of their own legal medicine by invoking the Supreme Court decision last year. And that decision was the Trump administration's decision to rescind the Obama administration deferred action for childhood arrivals policy was inadequately justified. Chief Justice John Roberts' decision to join the court's liberal wing last June amounted to a reprieve for dreamers who came to the U.S. as a children or were bought by parents who lacked legal status. The ruling angered many conservatives by frustrating Trump's immigration policies and describing pressure on Congress to negotiate with the administration, but conservative legal activists are now trying to leverage the legal precinct to challenge Biden's efforts to reverse various Trump-era policies. One thing here, and I think a lot of people would agree with me on this. You could definitely mention it in the comment sections or talk with me on Discord or whatever if you don't ultimately agree with this. But I do think the Dreamers is one of a policy that needs to have some drastic change. Because ultimately what the United States does with the Dreamers is kind of keep up a facade that the United States is doing something good and trying to help out these people who are desperately trying to start a new life. But really what they're doing is keeping them in a system of not really rewarding them for what they did, but almost keeping them as objects and just kind of trading them off between the two sides. And they never really get what ultimately they try to come to the United States for. It needs some drastic change to not keep the Dreamers in so much of a back and forth situation. The new suit argues that Biden's officials have not adequately justified their decisions to remain in orders that the Trump administration issued last year under an authority known as Title 42, halting entry of many foreigners to the U.S. as part of a virus migration effort. The suit also alleges that a former Biden official granted to allow unaccompanied minors into U.S. has been informally expanded to cover families with children. Justice Department spokesperson declined to comment on this suit. By filing the case in Fort Worth, Paxton virtually granted that it would be assigned to one of the two conservative Republicans appointed judges. Court records show that it was intended assigned to one of those jurors that Trump's appointee, Mark Pittman. The suit paints COVID-19 as a grave danger to the U.S. and city Centers for Disease Control and Prevention death statistics that Trump claimed earlier this year far exaggerated the actual number of casualties. America's first attorney on the case, Jen Humpleman, served as a top Trump administrative advisor on immigration policy at the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice. So they're filing a lawsuit of claims of increased COVID cases and improper management of Biden's policy or change of policy. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and there's definitely some very large backlash as we've seen from our last two articles against Trump's officials, but I would say a lot of people in general are not very happy with Biden's policies as well. But as I mentioned earlier and gave a little bit of a tease to, we have our good old Ted Cruz back in the news a couple of weeks ago about him visiting the border, and this is just a 3-minute video here. I'm going to turn this on, or 3-minute clip, I should say. He was talking a lot more than 3 minutes. Anybody that knows politicians know that is what's going to happen. We're going to resize the video here for the people who are watching it on our live section, our live view. As I wait for that, I'll be interested once again to know your thoughts about what you think of Biden's policies or what you think would be your perfect border situation. Are you someone that's for more open borders? Are you someone that's for more closed border system in trying to take care of your motivations and your desires first? So as we wait for this video to load back up, I will take a drink break here. Alright, here we go. Move this back to the start. Alright, so here we go.
Thank you, John. It is great to be back in the Rio Grande Valley. It is terrific that John and I were able to bring 18 senators down to Texas, down to the Valley, to see firsthand the crisis that is unfolding here. All of us today witnessed the Biden cages. What is occurring here on the border is heartbreaking, and it is a tragedy. You know, as we stand by the banks of the Rio Grande, we have an army of TV cameras here. It is striking that not a single one of these cameras is allowed in the Daunte facility. We requested that media accompany us in the facility. The Biden administration said no. The Trump administration had allowed media inside facilities like that. The Obama administration had allowed media inside facilities like that. The George W. Bush administration had. The Bill Clinton administration had. But the Biden administration wants to hide what is going on here. Not only that, but a number of us took pictures and took videos because the American people have a right to know what is happening here. And the Biden administration sent down political handlers to try to keep silent, to try to keep the American people not knowing what's going on. The Daunte facility is a giant tent city built with a capacity of 250. It has nearly 4,000 people in it. We saw cages after cages after cages of little girls, of little boys, lying side by side, touching each other, covered with reflective emergency blankets. There was no 6-foot space, there was no 3-foot space, there wasn't a 3-inch space between the children lined up one after the other after the other. And children as young as infants, we saw playpens with infants and toddlers playing. We also saw a group of children who just today tested positive for COVID-19. The Daunte facility alone reports roughly 10% of the individuals being held there are testing positive for COVID-19. Rates dramatically higher than the U.S. population.
So the videos go into a little bit of a loop here, but we can definitely talk about what he was saying here. And I mentioned a lot of what Mr. Cruz said here. But first I want to talk about, because I'm not sure if I mentioned it on our last episode because it was during a snowstorm. But Ted Cruz, regardless of what you ultimately think about him, is usually somebody that you would say may not be the smartest person by any means, may not be the smartest person in the room, but is someone that usually many people said was politically smart in trying to position himself to become somebody that many conservatives or many Republicans think to when they think of conservatives. Who, name your top 3 conservatives. He wants to be someone that comes up in that top 3. And he's trying to position himself to be that person. And many would say trying to position himself to be the next president of the United States of America. Or become president at some point. But he did something that was remarkably stupid. During the ice storm of Texas here, he decided that he was going to be super smart and take a vacation during a extremely bad situation. And because of that, he ended up getting caught. His wife's, DMs ended up getting released. And you could argue that that was something that shouldn't have happened, because just because you're the wife of someone that's in politics doesn't mean that you should be scrutinized at the same level. Scrutinized isn't a word, but I think you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, so I think that was just remarkably dumb for what many people think is generally somebody that's politically smart. But we're going to read one more article that was talking about Ted Cruz and many Republican senators or government officials that visited the border in Mexico. And then we will end the episode after this. So this is by The Guardian here. Republican Senator Ted Cruz mocked for a documentary-style trip to the U.S.-Mexico border. The Republican Senator Ted Cruz was drawing criticism for taking a trip to American southern border as the conservative Texan politician once again became the butt of internet jokes and memes. In the style of a wildlife documentary, Cruz captured the experience with the help of professional photographers and shared his recent journey to the U.S.-Mexico border. Thursday night on social media, where he aimed to shed light on what Republicans have dubbed a crisis. Shooting are sporting a dark green fishing shirt and matching baseball cap with the Texas flag. Cruz spoke at a press conference where he sought to paint a drastic picture of his experience. On the other side of the river, we have been listening and seeing cartel members, human traffickers, right on the other side of the river, waving flashlights and yelling and taunting Americans, taunting the Border Patrol. Despite his claims that the border situation is a direct result of the Biden administration immigration policies, residents in the Rio Grande Valley have said no such crisis exists. In fact, the number of border crossings under the Biden administration largely mirrored those under the former Trump administration. Cruz was accompanied by 18 other Republican senators, including John Cornyn, Susan Collins, and Lindsey Graham. After claiming he ran into heckling cartel members and saw a dead body floating in Rio Grande, Cruz was derided by many, including a former Congressman Beto O'Rourke, who said, "You're in a Border Patrol boat armed with machine guns. The only threat you face is unarmed children and families who are seeking asylum, as well as the occasional heckler." O'Rourke added, "If you are looking for a crisis to cosplay senator for, I'm happy to point you to the right direction." Some compared Cruz's attempt at embedded journalism to a scene from Jurassic Park, and it goes on to list some senators and political people, probably journalist, calling out Trump's for his documentary style and trip to the border. Because once again, many people saw what Ted Cruz was doing as similar to what Biden was doing, wearing a mask on a Zoom conference when it was online, and he was the only one there, no one next to him, inside, whatever you want to say, as virtue signaling. And Ted Cruz has done many things that people would consider to be very politicianly and very much a virtual signaling effort. So I thought I was going to talk about that, although this was in March 16th to around middle of March, and we're all the way in almost May now. It's been about a month later. So this is pretty much very old news at this point, but I thought it was kind of a funny thing to end today's episode with, and I don't think that it was active at the last time we did a podcast. So thank you everybody for stopping by either on Twitch, YouTube, Trovo, or DLive. Thank you for watching live. Thank you everybody who's listening to this as any form of a podcast. And I hope to see you on the next one. And definitely let me know if you're interested in hearing any of those special streams I did as edited versions to go up as a podcast. Hope you enjoy.